question. Does anyone know what happened to empathy? You know, like the ability that human beings have to relate to one another's feelings and kind of experience them vicariously. I feel like we as a society had it at one point, but we lost it somewhere. My theory is that the advent of the internet and smartphones and our ability to live in our own little information and spin bubbles kind of eroded our empathy over time, and now we kind of find ourselves without it to a large extent. By the way, this is a review of a Batman comic book. Detective Comics number 1099, specifically. Yeah, on the opening pages of this issue, Batman talks about how, like, the worst enemies he's ever faced are the ones who have no empathy whatsoever. Like people who can just cast aside other human lives without giving it a second thought. And, you know, I'm not going to mention any names, but that did kind of make me think about modern politics and what Batman might think if he were alive in the real world and could read the news. You know what I mean? You know, my interest in Detective Comics this year has kind of waxed and waned at various points. But kudos to our author here, Tom Taylor, for pulling me back in with that passage. Lee Garbett has been our guest penciler for these past few issues. I've always enjoyed his work. You know, as far as I'm concerned, he's welcome back in Gotham City anytime. So I've talked a decent amount about how One World Under Doom, Marvel's latest event comic, is basically a big allegory for Trumpism and Donald Trump's effect on the world at large in the last 10 years or so. Well, One World Under Doom number 6 just came out this week, and it's quite possibly our Trumpiest issue yet. For better or for worse. So in true political fashion, Reed Richards challenges Dr. Doom to a debate in this issue, like a nationally televised debate, and if Doom loses, he has to give up his power as, like, Emperor of the world. During the debate, we see Reed attack Dr. Doom with things like logic and reason and recent history, and Doom responds with, like, emotional attacks, like attacks that appeal to the general public's emotions, and that's a strategy that the Trump side of the aisle knows pretty well, I think. Of course, the whole debate is a diversion for the Avengers to find some dirt on Dr. Doom, basically, like find something incriminating. And they do, and what they find is, in my opinion, again, very Trumpy. I mean, not literally, but, you know, if Trump were a comic book supervillain, it feels like the kind of thing he would do. You know, Marvel is the biggest and most successful comic book publisher in the world right now. And, you know, given the position they're in, they really don't have to publish a story that's this relevant and, like, politically charged. But they did, and they are. And I give them a lot of credit for it. You know, I've said it a bunch of times, but I'll keep saying it so long as I believe it's true. One World Under Doom is the best event comic Marvel has produced since Civil War. Oh, and by the way, I love the cover to this issue with Dr. Doom tearing Reed Richards in half, literally. It's a fun visual. Every barista has a superhero complex / fantasy to some degree. Yeah, I was a barista for about 8 years, so I can vouch for that. And that's what Whatever Happened to the Crimson Justice number 3 made me think of. So yeah, Crimson Justice is about a retired superhero being lured back into action, and in his civilian life, he's basically a barista. And you know, in terms of baristas in the superhero complex, what can I say? That's what serving all kinds of life-bringing elixirs to various people super early in the morning at a breakneck speed will do to you. And also, if you turn the apron around, it becomes a cape. The story is moving along at about the pace that I thought it would, which is not a bad thing. Also not a bad thing, the fact that there is no graphic sex or violent act in this issue, the way there kind of was in the first 2 issues. Although, depending on your perspective, I guess that could be a bad thing. Crimson Justice does a good job, or at least has so far, of being clearly inspired by The Dark Knight Returns, but not ripping off The Dark Knight Returns. Like, there are various ideas in Crimson Justice that clearly could have been in The Dark Knight Returns, which turns 40 next year, believe it or not. But to their credit, our creators here have taken them and done their own thing. Like, for instance, Crimson Justice has a dead teenage sidekick. And in this issue, he's visited by a vision of his dead teenage sidekick. If I'm remembering things correctly, in The Dark Knight Returns, the reason that Batman retired in the first place is because of the death of Robin, Jason Todd. So you see how the idea could have kind of worked in The Dark Knight Returns, but in Crimson Justice they used it for their own purposes. And for the record, I don't simply look at Crimson Justice, the hero, as a Batman clone. Very Batman-like, but they've done a good enough job of making him distinct in his own right. That, like I said, inspired by, but not ripped off. Cheetah and Cheshire Rob the Justice League is a story with a lot of potential. And while you can't buy groceries with potential, as they say, I've got a pretty good feeling about this one. I'll explain why in just a minute. So this book is about Cheetah, who's like a super-powered werewolf, only she's a cheetah, and Cheshire, who's a martial arts type assassin who specializes in poisons, getting ready to team up and steal something from the Justice League Watchtower in space. So Greg Rucka is our author here. And, you know, I've been reading Greg Rucka's DC stuff since I was in high school, so, you know, he's always a welcome name to see on a project for me. Plus, Rucka has about as good a history as you'll find writing strong female characters, especially in this universe. Whether you're talking about Wonder Woman, or Lois Lane, or Renee Montoya, Huntress, Batwoman. So he's really well suited for a project like this. And one that happens to feature 2 strong female characters that might be a little underserved in the grand scheme of things. And then our artist here is Nicola Scott. Her art is gorgeous any day of the week. I last saw her over on Titans, where I think I was particularly complimentary of her facial work, like the way she draws characters' faces. You know, I say this with all due respect, but when Nicola Scott draws a character, it doesn't look like your standard comic book character drawing. You know, these look like artistic renderings of real people in the real world, and that's very much the case in this issue. I enjoyed her work on Cheshire in particular. Cheshire's motivation for going after this big MacGuffin on the Justice League Watchtower is established here. I'm not sure if I missed it or if it's just not been presented yet, but I'm wondering what Cheetah's motivation for this is, outside of just the power that comes with the item. I assume that's something that will be revealed with time, though. I really have every confidence in this creative team at large. And that's why Cheetah and Cheshire Rob the Justice League is really kind of a no-brainer for me. If you're a DC Comics fan who's looking to read about characters kind of outside the usual suspects, I highly recommend this one. So generally speaking, it's considered rude and in bad taste to comment on another person's body in public. I mean, I know that. I know it would be especially inappropriate for me as a man to talk about a woman's body. You don't do that. But you know, I think I'm gonna risk it here and make a couple of comments. And I should be okay considering that the woman in question is not a real person. She appears in Supergirl number 4, which comes out today. Relax, it's nothing bad. It's actually a good thing. So in this issue, Supergirl is more or less put in charge of her arch nemesis, Lesla Lar, and making sure that she stays reformed and doesn't do any supervillain type stuff. So naturally, Lesla becomes a superhero, luminary. And you know, I think I've said something about this before, but I really appreciate the fact that Lesla is drawn with a different body type than Supergirl and female superheroes in general. She's curvier, she has bigger legs, she might be a little bit taller than Supergirl too. I don't know if voluptuous is a word that's appropriate to use in this context, but she has a different kind of body than you're used to seeing on a female superhero. And I'm not even trying to comment on it in a sexual context. The context I'm using here is more about inclusivity. And you know what I also like is that Lesla's body type has not been commented on at all. They're not, you know, spotlighting it. It just kind of is what it is. It's a fact of life. You know, from a writing standpoint, this Supergirl series makes a much more frequent use of thought bubbles than you usually see in a modern comic book. That's interesting. It makes for a different kind of reading experience, that's for sure. You know, stories about Superman and Superman-adjacent characters like Supergirl have felt a little bit more moralistic in recent months than they have in quite a while. And that's kind of apparent in this issue as Supergirl teaches Lesla how to be a superhero. I'm wondering if they're doing that on purpose, or if I'm just noticing the moralistic things a little bit more because I enjoyed the Superman movie so much. Sophie Campbell, our author and artist here, really seems to enjoy kind of playing dress-up with the characters, not just in terms of Supergirl's different costumes, which we've seen in the series so far, but in this issue, our three female characters go to like a goth party, and so they dress up all gothic-like. It's fun, you know, no harm, no foul. Okay, new rule. Okay, new rule. Superman needs a science buddy that isn't Batman. That way, when Superman has a science question, we're not needlessly dropping Batman into Superman stories and having him pull focus away from Superman. Unfortunately, that was one of the things I was thinking about coming out of Superman, the Kryptonite Spectrum #1. So this story is about Superman discovering 4 new varieties of kryptonite, and it takes a look at what they do to him, basically. So this is the same creative team that does the book Ice Cream Man. That doesn't really mean much to me because I've never read Ice Cream Man. I have heard good things though, and I've always enjoyed Martin Morazzo's art, so I was interested to see what this team would do with Superman. And you know, in general, what they gave us here was pretty good. But unfortunately, this story does fall into what I call the Batman trap. Yeah, if you're new around here, this is kind of a pet peeve that I have. Creators needlessly dropping Batman into Superman stories, thus distracting from Superman. There's no need for Batman to be here from a story perspective. I really don't know why they chose to put him there, other than just for the sake of putting him there. If Superman needs a science buddy, or, you know, somebody to go to with sciencey questions about kryptonite, I would think that that's a role for Steel, John Henry Irons. You know, you could put him in the story. Mr. Terrific would also be a fine choice after his inclusion in the Superman movie this year. Setting aside the whole Batman thing, though, I pretty much enjoyed what they gave us here. Again, Martin Morazzo's art is tremendous. The kryptonite that we see spotlighted in this issue affects Superman's perception of time. Like, so if you've got 10 sequential events lined up next to each other, this kryptonite mixes up the events. It mixes up the sequence. So what's fun about this issue is that it presents us with those out-of-sequence events and then eventually we get to see the sequence that they're supposed to be in. You know, it's kind of like it shows us a puzzle, and then it gives us the answer to the puzzle afterward. I hesitate to even make this comparison, but from a writing standpoint, and to an extent an artistic standpoint, this does kind of have an all-star Superman-inspired feel to it. I don't know if there exists a better Superman story to be inspired by creatively than All-Star Superman. So if that's the fence they're swinging for, Godspeed, I say. But I am kind of going to be a pest at the end here and remind you that All-Star Superman was a story that did not fall into the Batman trap. Just saying. Have the Ghostbusters gone woke? Because God forbid, being a little bit more compassionate and inclusive would be worse than the second coming of Gozer. But opinions may vary after reading Ghostbusters Dead Man's Chest #3. So Phoebe Spengler has a friend in this book named Sammy. And I think this issue is the one where we learn for the first time that Sammy is gender non-binary. They use they, them pronouns. That doesn't bother me, but I can see a certain anti-woke section of the audience crying foul. Hey, don't put that in my comics! Woke trash! I've heard that term a decent amount. As I kind of alluded to, I don't think there's anything wrong with stories like this being a little bit more inclusive. You know, God forbid we try and make the world a little more kind. And there's even kind of sort of a precedent here. As in Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, it was sort of vaguely alluded to that Phoebe is queer. I understand that's not exactly the same thing, but hopefully you see my point. The moral arc does kind of give it a little bit of a Saturday morning cartoon feel. But, you know, you can argue that some of the best Ghostbusters stories ever told were on a Saturday morning cartoon. So, there's that. Either way, the pirate ghost stuff is really fun. It's played for laughs when we open this issue in a very Ghostbustery sort of way. But yeah, this creative team definitely has a firm, solid grasp on these characters, this world, this franchise. I'm more than open to seeing more from them. And you know, reading this issue actually prompted me to go back and watch a couple real Ghostbusters episodes last night. I'm looking forward to whatever the new animated show on Netflix is going to be. When are we getting that? Am I going to get shadow banned again for talking about political stuff during my little comic book videos? Even though it's not modern political stuff necessarily. Well, there's only one way to find out. This is Captain America #2. So the so-called sliding timescale of comics is very much in effect here, as Captain America's origin is kind of revamped to bring him out of the ice during the events of the Iraq War in the 2000s. And we meet, both in the present day and via flashbacks, David Colton, who is like the 21st century Captain America, Steve Rogers' modern day counterpart, so to speak. And we see via flashbacks what events kind of shaped David Colton's perspective, his values, and how a Captain America of the 21st century is different from the Captain America of the World War II era. It's super surreal to me to see the Iraq War in like a retro story, because, you know, the Iraq War happened when I was in high school, and to me that wasn't really that long ago. But it is really interesting, at least to me, to get Steve Rogers' perspective on sort of that era's mindset, you know, that George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld mindset with like America as the police of the world. It's even more surreal for me to think that there was a time when America considered itself some kind of moral authority. Were those easier times? Were they simpler times? I don't know. Regardless, this book has my attention, and I'm very much looking forward to more from this creative team and the David Colton character. Did I mention Dr. Doom is in this story? Yeah, the U.S. kind of invades Latveria, Dr. Doom's fictional home country, for the same reason, more or less, that they invaded Iraq, and Captain America has to grapple with that. So yeah, I guess I kind of buried the lead on that one. But you know what, I've given Dr. Doom a lot of coverage lately, so I don't feel that bad about it. So in reading Hyde Street number 8, I don't think we're supposed to be thinking about the level of cuteness that is or isn't achieved by Pranky, the evil Boy Scout turned wolf boy. But inevitably there is a certain Muppet-like level of cuteness there. I mean, he's a little furry creature. But yeah, last issue, Pranky took a mask from Mr. X-Ray's office, put it on, and in the process turned into like a wolf boy. So in this issue, he and Mr. X-Ray try and undo the effects, and in the process they meet a new character. The art on this book from Yvonne Reese, inker Danny Mickey, and colorist Brad Anderson seems to be progressively getting better and better as our creators get more comfortable with the world they're in and kind of stretch their legs. And it was pretty strong from the start, so that's saying something. For instance, there are like some profile shots of a few characters in this book that I think are really good, this being one of them. Tremendous variant cover here from Geiger artist Gary Frank. That's a fun idea, grotesque but fun. You know, the story of Hyde Street, like the linear story, isn't progressing at an especially brisk pace. You know, it's kind of slow, quite frankly. And you know, in another book, that might be a problem. But in this book, it actually works because the world of Hyde Street that has been created here is just fun to explore, and it's fun to meet new characters and kind of see what's going on. Like, for example, there's a page in this issue where Pranky jumps on top of a fish tank in Mr. X-Ray's office and just randomly finds some little piranha people. We don't really spend any time with the piranha people, okay? We don't, explore their story or whatever. But they're there, and we can come back to them later. In fact, I fully expect them to come back to the piranha people at a later date. The effect is kind of like playing an open-world video game, where, like, you have your destination that you're moving toward, but along the way, you can go on all these various little side quests and see different Easter eggs and stuff. And you know you've got a story that's at least very good when it's fun to just sort of look around the world that's been created and, spend time in that world. The Wizard of Oz universe that L. Frank Baum created, that's like that. The Star Wars universe is like that, etc. And mind you, I'm not trying to make an apples-to-apples comparison there, but Hyde Street definitely does seem to be of the same ilk as those universes. And if you're Ghost Machine or a Ghost Machine fan, that's not a good thing, that's a great thing. Thor isn't quite himself in The Mortal Thor number 1. So in this book, not only does Thor have no memory of who he is, but the world at large has completely forgotten about Thor and all the Asgardian Norse mythology stuff in general. Thor basically gets Spider-Man No Way Home, if you take my meaning. So I have a problem with Thor, like the Marvel Universe iteration of Thor, in the sense that it's a me problem, not a him problem. It's kind of similar to the problem I have with the Legion of Superheroes over at DC. I've never been able to get into Thor or Thor comics. I guess I enjoyed the movies well enough, but that's about it. I need a good reason to care about Thor and his characters and his universe. and I've just never really gotten one, or I've never been sufficiently enticed to come and find one. But you know, when I read about the premise to the Mortal Thor, I thought it sounded interesting, and maybe like the idea and the reason to care that I've needed for so many years. And you know, so far so good as far as this issue is concerned. The art is very accessible, and the story is even more accessible as far as like new readers and that coveted jumping on point is concerned. Thor, or Sigurd as he's known now, doesn't remember very much about himself, and thus, for a new reader like me, I think I'm kind of going to be learning about Thor at the same pace that Sigurd is learning about Thor, and that's a promising experience to jump into from a reading perspective. So yeah, I've got high hopes here, at least early on, that the Mortal Thor is going to be the book that finally gets me to care about this character. Although, if nothing else, we have beautiful Alex Ross covers to look forward to. Oh, by the way, if you like seeing people get hit in the head with hammers, like realistically, this is the issue for you, because Sigurd goes to town on a couple of bad guys here.